Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's info session on major capital grants. My name is Megan Tate, and I'm the Director of Community Grants at the Winnipeg Foundation. So first, a couple of housekeeping notes. As I've already said, today's session is going to be recorded for those who weren't able to make it, or for those of you that really liked it and want to watch it again. And we will be posting it on the Foundation's social media channels. Something I've learned about Zoom is that when a session is being recorded, that includes the chat sessions, and it does include also the private chat sessions. So if you're chatting one-on-one with someone, that may get picked up on the recording. So, if you don't like the poster behind me and you're letting somebody know, just know that that will be captured as part of the recording as well. We're expecting about 140 people on today's call, so we ask that you keep yourselves muted. And if you do have questions, we invite you to use that chat feature. We've left time at the end of the session to answer some of those questions through the chat. So that's a great feature that we use during Zoom. And we ask you to keep your questions general. If you've got questions that are really specific to your organization's circumstances, you can always follow up directly with a member of our grants team. So if we were meeting together in person, which I so wish that we were, and I know that we'll be able to again, I would begin the session by acknowledging that we are gathered on Treaty 1 territory. And so I'd still like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojai Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I invite all of you to take a moment wherever you are to reflect on the land where you are today. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Winnipeg Foundation. I'm going to give you an overview of all of the grant making at the Winnipeg Foundation. And then we'll dig into the main topic for today, which is major capital grants. So going over the criteria, the application process, a little bit of what we use in the assessment process, and some examples of some recent community grants. So about us, we are the Winnipeg Foundation. And as you might have heard or seen in the paper, this is a milestone year for the Winnipeg Foundation. It's our 100th anniversary. And so we're so proud to say that the Winnipeg Foundation is Canada's very first community foundation. There's now 191 of us from coast to coast to coast, but be proud knowing that the very first one was right here in Winnipeg. Something else that you might have heard about the Winnipeg Foundation is that our longtime CEO, Rick Frost, is stepping down at the end of April. We've all benefited from Rick's wisdom and his leadership, but we're also really looking forward to welcoming our new CEO, Sky Bridges. Sky actually unofficially started with the foundation on Monday. He's going to spend the next 3 weeks learning more about our work and more about our people, and then we'll officially take over the role of CEO at the end of April. Another thing to note is that most of our staff are still all working from home. You can tell I'm in my dining room. So really the best way to connect with us is by email. If you have a particular grant staff person that you connect with, feel free to reach out to them directly. We also have grants at Winnipeg Foundation email address where you can send your inquiries and we'll pass it along to the person best able to answer your questions. So a little bit about what makes us a community foundation, and that's really our donors. So today, the Winnipeg Foundation is a collection of more than 4,000 permanent endowment funds established by donors from all walks of life. These gifts are pooled and invested, and each year we grant a portion of the income earned based on whatever our spending policy is in that year. This year, we're pleased to report that our spending policy is 5%. So in January, we announced what our total grant making was in 2020, and it was a remarkable $73 million to over 1,000 charitable organizations. This is the biggest grant making year the Winnipeg Foundation has ever had, and it's partly due to an increase in grant dollars that we made available to respond to COVID-19, reallocating some dollars that had been set aside for special projects that were no longer moving forward, as well as an increase in generosity from our donors who were also responding to COVID-19. One thing I always like to share when I'm doing info sessions like this one is this chart that you see on your screen. So I think when most people think of the Winnipeg Foundation and grant making, they think of the grant dollars that are awarded in response to applications from community organizations like yours. But actually there's a wide variety of grant making activity at the foundation, including payments from our agency and designated funds, donor advised grants, scholarships, some of the leadership projects that we take on. And last year, about 23% of our grant making was what we call responsive grants. So again, those grants that are in response to applications. It's important to note that this year, actually in 2021, our grant making budget has increased over previous years, again, so that we can respond to COVID and the impact it's having on the charitable sector. I should note that we don't know yet what our budget is going to be for major capital grants. The applications that are submitted this spring, the final decision for those grants will actually be in November, which is the start of the foundation's next fiscal year. But when I get into the presentation, I'll give you a sense of what the budget for those projects have been in previous years. So a little bit about what our responsive grant making looks like in 2021. We know that the need for funding is great, and we do anticipate that our 2021 intakes will be very competitive. Once again, in order to respond to COVID-related needs in the community, we've adjusted our granting calendar. The intake for stabilization grants just closed at the end of March. We received over 270 applications for that particular intake, and the review process has just started for those. We continue to have our one-time community grants. The next intake for that is going to be in the fall. And of course, all of our special granting programs will continue, although some of the timelines have changed. So we just really encourage you to check our website to see any upcoming grant application deadlines. Something to note about resilient grants, which is what we were calling our multi-year funding opportunity. In 2020, we had planned to relaunch our multi-year granting program, building on the pilot of that initiative from the 2017 and 2018 years. Unfortunately, the world had other plans, and so we did postpone that program to be able to provide stabilization grants, knowing that many organizations were going to have immediate needs, again, based on the impact from COVID-19. And so unfortunately, we have postponed the launch of resilient grants indefinitely. This just allows the foundation kind of maximum flexibility to respond to whatever's happening in our community. And I wish I had a crystal ball, but we don't know what the rest of this year is going to look like or what 2022 is going to bring. So again, our overall goal is to be as flexible as possible with our grant making. So that brings us to major capital grants, which is why you've joined us today. So major capital grants, it is one of our special grant programs. And so what that means is you can apply for a major capital grant without impacting your opportunity to apply for other grants at the Winnipeg Foundation. You can also apply for a major capital grant if you have an outstanding grant. So for example, if you have an open community grant where you haven't completed that project or submitted the final report, you are still eligible to apply for a major capital grant. This is currently our only program that has a two-stage application process, with stage 1 applications due in the middle of May. And this program is specifically requests for capital projects where the request to the Winnipeg Foundation is $100,000 or greater. And so major capital grants typically fall into two categories. It can include major capital projects where organizations have undertaken a formal capital campaign. So think of the Winnipeg Art Gallery, Manitoba Museum, the Bruce Oak Recovery Recovery Center. So those are big capital infrastructure projects where the campaign goal is typically $1 million and can go anywhere up from there. The other area that the Winnipeg Foundation funds through this particular granting stream is simply very large capital projects where the total budget is several $100,000, but doesn't necessarily require a formal capital campaign to get the project going. A final thing to note about major capital grants is that it is our most competitive grant program. So for example, in a regular community grants intake, approximately 85% of the applications we receive can expect to receive some level of support from the foundation. You might not receive the full amount that you've requested, but if the foundation's grants committee feels like we can make a meaningful contribution to your project, you still will see some level of support. For major capital grants, less than half of the organizations who submit a stage 1 application receive funding through this program. So just a couple of statistics from some recent years. So in 2018, we received 20 stage 1 applications with requests totaling $5.5 million. Of those 20 applications, 10 were invited to stage 2. And of those invited to stage 2, 9 were funded for a total of $1.4 million. So you can see we went from 5.5 million down to 1.4. Last year was our biggest intake ever for major capital grants, tons of amazing projects. We received 25 stage 1 applications with the total amount requested close to $11 million. Of those 25 applications, 14 were invited to submit a stage 2 application. Unfortunately, somewhere between stage 1 and stage 2, one of those projects decided not to move forward. So in the end, we had 13 stage 2 applications, and of those, 11 were funded for a total of $3.5 million. So as you can see, it does vary quite a bit in terms of the applications received and the budget that the board allocates towards those projects. And it really just depends on the applications we receive in any given year. So a little bit about the eligibility criteria for our major capital grants program. So like all grant programs at the Winnipeg Foundation, your organization must have a valid Canadian registered charity number. Your project must primarily benefit the people of Winnipeg, again, similar to most other grant programs at the Winnipeg Foundation. Grants are awarded for a specific purpose or specific project. And for major capital grants, we really define capital as bricks and mortar. So construction of a new building, renovation or expansion to an existing space, those infrastructure projects. And finally, to note that grants will not cover costs undertaken before the grants committee or board decision meeting date. And so the final decisions for these major capital grants won't happen until November. And so you'll need to be mindful of that when planning your project. That said, many of these major capital projects are very large, multi-phase initiatives. And so we know that sometimes earlier phases of a project will move forward while you're waiting to hear from the Winnipeg Foundation, and that's fine. Just that our contribution couldn't go to any costs incurred prior to our board making their decision. Also want to note that a major capital grant can cover a wide number of costs related to a capital project, things like architecture fees, site testing. So sometimes people have to do some environmental remediation to a site before they're able to proceed with their capital project. Sometimes you need to prepare a site before you can start the capital. And then of course, construction costs would all be eligible for major capital grant funding. So a little bit about the application process. So as I mentioned, it is a two-stage application. So stage 1, applications will open next week on April 15th. And they're due on May 15th at 4:30 p.m. sharp. And we do ask you all to take note of that time, that we're quite firm with the application deadline, and late applications will not be accepted. Organizations will be notified of the status of their stage 1 application in late June, either to let you know that you've been invited to submit a more detailed stage 2 application, or to let you know that unfortunately you will not be moving forward in the application process. And it is important to note that an invitation to stage 2 does not guarantee funding. It simply means that our board of directors is interested in learning more about your project. So for those organizations that are invited to submit a stage 2 application, those applications will be due at the end of July, again at 4:30 p.m. sharp, with final decision notification in November. And all of these dates are also available on our website. So one thing to let you guys know about that is new at the Winnipeg Foundation that we're really excited about is that we are launching a new grants management system called Smart Simple. So for those of you who have applied to the Winnipeg Foundation in the past, you will know that our current online application system is a bit dated, is probably a kind word for it. So we're really excited to launch this new grants management system, and Major Capital Grants is going to be the first application program that will be using the new system. We think that there's a really user-friendly design. We're excited that it's going to be a one-stop shop for applicants. So you'll be able to see all of the grant applications that you've submitted, notifications that you've received from the foundation. It'll be a way for you to track grant payments, and you'll also be able to submit and manage final reports through the same system. So we're really excited about that. That said, it is a new system, so there's going to be a learning curve both for you as applicants and for us as staff. So really encourage you to give yourselves extra time when submitting your stage 1 application, and please be patient with us. We might not know the answers to your questions right off the top of our heads because we're also learning this new system. We are working on some educational resources to guide you through the process, and so we're hoping that those will be available when the portal opens next week. One thing to let you know that before you can access the application itself, you'll need to create a profile for your organization. The good news is you're only going to have to do this once. Once you set up a profile for your organization in the grants management system, that'll be your profile for any other future applications that you submit to the foundation. We just ask that you keep that information up to date. This system is completely separate from our current system, so you'll need a new username and a new password. And again, just a reminder that this new system is currently only available to our major capital grants. So if you're applying for other foundation programs, such as the upcoming Nourishing Potential Grants intake or professional development grant, those proposals will still be submitted through the old system. So our goal is to slowly add grant programs to this new system as we learn more about how it works. So yeah, our new grant management system, very excited, but also lots to learn. Okay, so now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how to apply. So stage 1 application, also known as a letter of intent or an LOI. Some things to know about that. So the full text of your application will be reviewed by our board of directors. So this is unusual for a number of reasons. Most grant applications are reviewed by our grants committee, but these proposals are reviewed by our full board, and our staff doesn't do any edits or anything. What you prepare is what will go to our board of directors. So the goal for your stage 1 application is to give us a snapshot of your case for support. Try to keep yourself to 300 words. We're looking for how you can clearly articulate your case for support, which is an essential component of any capital campaign. So some of the things that we're looking for include a brief description of your project, some information about why that project is needed, and how it will benefit the community. In stage 1, we also do ask for a high-level budget for the project, both the anticipated costs and the revenues. Information that we're looking for in the budget section include how much you're requesting from the Winnipeg Foundation, as well as other anticipated sources of financial support, whether it's from government, other foundations, fundraising events, private donors, that kind of thing. The budget form in the application has a section where you can note whether the funding is confirmed or not. So if you've raised a certain amount already from private donors, you'll want to note that as confirmed. If you have an application outstanding to another foundation, you can note that as pending. What we're really looking for in this section is to see where you're at with your fundraising goal. So have you secured funding? Are you just at the beginning of your fundraising campaign? And so this budget section really lets us see where you're at with your project. A couple of additional tips for your stage 1 application. Please be concise and clear. Our board is not going to read pages and pages of a proposal. That's really what the stage 2 application is for, is to provide that more detail about your project. Avoid jargon and acronyms. We know that a lot of organizations have specific words that are specific to your field that might not be commonly known to lay people like our grant staff or our board, so do that. And the final tip is really make sure you proofread your application before you submit it. You want to put forward a really polished proposal to our board of directors. So a little bit about how we assess those stage 1 applications. Some of the things that we consider include project readiness. So this is a big one. This is something that we're really looking for when it comes to major capital grants. So has your organization undertaken the necessary planning before embarking on this project, especially if it's a capital campaign? And something to note, if you're really in the early stages of a capital campaign and you feel that you need support to do some of that pre-work or some of that planning, that the Winnipeg Foundation, both through our organizational development grants and our one-time community grants, does accept proposals or requests for funding to help with project planning as well. So if you find yourself in those circumstances, it's worth checking out, again, both org development grants and our one-time community grants. Another significant part of the readiness piece is the funds that you've raised to date. And so there's certainly times when the Winnipeg Foundation will be one of the first funders into a project if there's a strategic reason for us to be one of the first in, and we believe that it'll leverage more funding. But it's probably a lot more common for the Winnipeg Foundation to be last in. So helping projects cross the finish line after a significant portion of the funds have been raised, including from government, private donors, other foundations. Certainly we know that philanthropic support can leverage government funding, so the environment has changed a little bit. And it'll be interesting to see as part of COVID recovery if governments will make more funding available for infrastructure projects. So that's something that we'll definitely be keeping an eye on. Another thing that goes into the assessment of stage 1 applications is simply the number of applications that we receive in the context of our budget. And there we go. Thank you. So where was it? Yes. So in terms of what falls into the stage 1 assessment is, again, simply how many applications that we receive. We know that in any given year, the foundation will allocate between $1 and $3 million to major capital grants. So we're not going to move $20 million of requests through to stage 2. That wouldn't be fair to all of those applications. And the final thing that we're looking for is balance across the charitable sector. The Winnipeg Foundation funds a wide variety of projects. So when we get to the end of the presentation, you'll see that we fund projects in healthcare, in education, community service, arts and culture, really looking at balance across the sector. So the next part, so you've submitted your stage 1 application, it's been reviewed by our board. They want to invite you to submit a more detailed stage 2 application. So you'll receive an email letting you know what the status of your application is. You'll find out both if you've been invited to stage 2 or if, again, unfortunately, you've not been invited to proceed. You'll be able to go back into the grant application portal and continue work on your application, the stage 2 application, and certainly more detailed information about what our expectations are around stage 2 will be included as part of that invitation. But it's fair to say that the stage 2 application for Major Capital Grant is very similar to our one-time community grant application. So if you filled out one of those before, you'll be fairly familiar with what we're looking for with that. And again, as I mentioned, the final decision for those applications will be in November. So some of the things that we'll be looking for in stage 2 is certainly a more detailed description of the project and the evidence of need for that project. If it's a capital campaign, we're going to want to know information about your capital campaign committee, the structure of it, what your fundraising goals and your timelines. If you've got campaign materials, there'll be certainly an opportunity to include those as part of the proposal. Like many of our applications, we want to know, how you will measure the success of the project. And then if there's any ongoing operating costs, we'll want to know how you anticipate covering that off as well. So some of the things that we look for in terms of the stage 2 assessment. Grant history is a big one. It would be fairly rare for an organization's very first grant from the Winnipeg Foundation to be at this scale. Typically, organizations who are applying for a major capital grant already do have a grant history with the Winnipeg Foundation. So that is one factor. The flip side of that is true as well. As you've seen, only a handful of organizations each year receive a major capital grant. So it would also be unlikely if your organization received a major capital grant last year that it would be unlikely that you would receive a second application or a second major capital grant so close together. Other things that we're looking for are clear measurable benefits of the program. And what I always like to say with major capital grants is, yes, we're funding bricks and mortar, but really what we're funding is what happens in that space, in those community spaces. So we want to know what the benefits are going to be to community. We're looking for lasting impact. Again, these are significant investments from the Winnipeg Foundation, so we know that we want to know that the impact of those grants will last for a long time. So we're not looking for sort of temporary fixes to spaces, or it'd be very unlikely for us to make a major capital grant investment in, for example, a space where you did not have a long-term lease agreement with your landlord, or if you didn't own the space. So lasting impact. Again, project preparedness is a big one that we're looking for in stage 2 applications. What's the business plan? Have you conducted a feasibility study? What's your fundraising plan? Those kinds of things. Organizational preparedness is another one. So, has your organization kind of signed on to this big project? Is your board on board? Are they fully engaged in this initiative? What other things do you have in place to help this project be successful? Again, we're going to be looking at what funding you've confirmed to date. Sometimes people like to provide letters of support from key stakeholders. This is where I'll note that the letters of support that are most meaningful are from perhaps users of the space, community partners who will also benefit from the space. Sometimes people like to include letters of support from their local city councilor or their local MLA. Those letters of support, if they're too generic, are less meaningful, although if your local political representative is also making a financial investment in the project, certainly we'd want to know about that. And finally, some of the things that we look for is ensuring that the project will meet accessibility and sustainability standards. So, you know, we want to make sure that any capital investments are going to be accessible to those who have differing mobility challenges, and we also are always mindful of environmental sustainability standards. So those are just some of the things that we look at as part of the stage two assessment. So some recent highlights. These are a few of the projects that were funded last year in 2020 through our major capital grants program. So the Winnipeg Chinese Cultural and Community Center received a grant of $100,000 to renovate their community space. The Northwest Co-op Community Health Center is home to a youth hub that is an initiative where young people can access a variety of services all kind of in one space. And they had outgrown the room that they were using for their youth hub. So a grant of $500,000 from the Winnipeg Foundation is going to allow them to expand their youth hub space. Centre Flavie Laurent had also outgrown their warehouse space. They're an organization that provides furniture and other household items to people who need it. And demand for their services has just grown, and they were running out of space to keep all the generous donations they were receiving. And so a grant of $250,000 is helping them both renovate their existing space and expand to new space next door to their current location. And finally, Ronald McDonald House has launched a capital campaign. Their current location is quite tired and out of date, and so they are opening a new location. I believe they broke ground this spring so that they can serve families whose children are in care at the Children's Hospital. So those are just a couple of the projects that were funded last year. Certainly not a comprehensive list, but just gives you a flavor of the variety of projects that are funded, as well as the variety of amounts that we're able to provide to different community organizations. So that really ends the formal part of the presentation. So we have set aside some time to answer any general questions that you might have. So my colleague, Carrie Ryan, is going to read out some of the questions that have been posted in the chat.
One of the questions that came in early on is around like sort of what is the best time to apply for a capital major capital grant? What's the best phase of a project for which to apply for a capital grant?
Yeah, that's a great question with not necessarily a simple answer. It really does depend on the project. And probably a little bit on the size of your project. So as you can see, last year, our largest grant that was awarded through major capital grants was $500,000. In my time at the foundation, there would be very few major capital grants that would have exceeded that amount. That there's maybe a handful of projects where the total contribution has been at the $1 million level, but that is quite rare. And so I would say if you have a very large capital campaign where the goal is, you know, several $1 million, that might be a time where you would want to wait until you had secured a fair bit of your funding before approaching the Winnipeg Foundation. If it's a more modest capital project, I would say that really any time could be an appropriate time to apply to the Winnipeg Foundation. And also a reminder that for those more modest renovation projects, that there is also that opportunity to apply for a one-time community grant. So yeah, that wasn't very clear. It depends on a lot of factors, but as a sort of a guideline, I'd say, you know, big capital campaigns, maybe wait until you've got some of your funding secured before you approach the foundation.
Okay, somewhat related, if you've got a capital project that is broken down into phases, should your budget include the entire scope of the project or just the phase that you're in right now?
Yeah, so again, that kind of, it depends. If it's a single project, so you are expanding your space, that we would want to know the full scope of that project. I think where it gets different, if you think of hospitals or universities that have vast multi-pronged campaigns, where it's, for multiple buildings on their campus or whatever the case might be, then those proposals, you could let us know kind of overall what the total campaign goal is, but focus in a little bit on what your request to the Winnipeg Foundation is. So for example, I won't even use real examples. So you're not that the University of Hamilton would apply, but you're the University of Hamilton and you've got a huge capital campaign that's going to be the science buildings and the arts buildings and the architecture buildings. But you're coming to the Winnipeg Foundation for like public student spaces, you could focus your budget on that particular component of the campaign. But if you are, so like Centre Flavie Laurent, for example, theirs was a multi-phase campaign. Part of it was renovating their existing space. Part of it was purchasing land to expand their space. That was multi-phased, but in that case, we kind of expected to see the holistic budget for that project.
Okay, question here, can a capital grant be combined with another grant? I think they mean another grant from a TWF grant program. So if I'm understanding correctly, that maybe you've already gotten like a one-time community grant for that capital project, and now you're asking for additional funds from the major capital. There isn't anything in our eligibility criteria that disallows it, but certainly, as I mentioned as part of the presentation, that grant history will always be a factor. So if you have already received Winnipeg Foundation funding for that particular capital project, that'll be a consideration as part of the review process. And kind of a similar question here, is it possible to apply for one grant for design costs and then another for the actual construction?
Yes, absolutely. If you were applying exclusively for design costs, major capital grants probably isn't quite the right fit for you. That's more where we would expect to see those planning design parts of a project through our one-time community grants, but certainly they would be there's many organizations. So for example, Manitoba Museum, we provided a community grant to that organization to help them do their capital campaign planning. And then they did go on to receive a major capital grant for the Winnipeg Gallery.
Okay, is anticipated revenue a requirement for consideration?
Yes, so it would be very rare for the Winnipeg Foundation to be the sole funder of a major capital project, that we would anticipate organizations to have other funders, even if they're not confirmed, but other potential sources of funding for their major capital grant. I can't think of another major capital grant where the Winnipeg Foundation would have been the sole funder.
Okay, question here about timelines. So the final approvals are made in November. This person is wondering what the timeline on projects would look like. When would construction have to take place?
Yeah, so again, it varies from project to project. So using the examples of the some of the projects that were funded last year. So Ronald McDonald House, for example, received notification of their Winnipeg Foundation funding in November. Obviously, they had a lot of other donors lined up as well, and they had their official groundbreaking this spring. So they have the full construction project ahead of them. We also provided a grant to the Children's Hospital Foundation. They were much further along in their process, so some of the construction costs had already been incurred, and the Winnipeg Foundation, our support were for some of those finishing construction details that hadn't yet been completed. So again, it really does depend on the project and the scale of the project. I know that's not a great answer. Perhaps if that's specific to your organization, you could always reach out to us directly.
Okay, there's a question here around granting priorities. Are there specific benefits to the community that the Winnipeg Foundation is currently focusing on when assessing applications?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. At the beginning of our strategic plan, which we launched in 2019, we had articulated some very specific grant making priorities for the foundation. That said, we know that COVID has been quite disruptive to our community, and so our goal at this time is really to be as open, as flexible as possible. And so my guidance would be to submit your stage 1 application and see how that shakes out with the other proposals that the foundation receives at that time.
Okay, a related question. In the past, funds had to be used within 2 years. Is that still the case?
So that is a typical guideline for our one-time community grants. That is written into the proposals for our major capital grants as well, but we do know that these projects can sometimes take much longer to move forward. So a great example is, oh gosh, I think it was 2017 or 2018 that we announced our funding for the Western Canada Aviation Museum. And that project has just broken ground as they sort of have worked to raise their funding. And so, of course, our commitment to that project is still there, even though it's exceeded the 2 years. So we do know that sometimes for these big capital projects, it can take a while for them to get moving. Maybe I'll say that said, knowing how much need there is in community, our board's preference is for projects that are closer to shovel ready, that we don't want to tie up foundation grant dollars for funds that aren't going to be accessed until way into the future. Sometimes that happens, and we certainly understand that, but I would say that our preference is probably closer to shovel ready projects.
Okay, question here from Jeff Carter. Could you elaborate on the advisability of organizations with partners to apply together as one and/or independently?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So if it is truly a collaborative project, we would advise people to submit the proposal collaboratively. At the end of the day, one organization will have to be the lead organization, and that's who the funding, if a grant is approved, that's who the funding will go to. But I think it shows that it's a truly collaborative initiative and would probably be our board's preference versus funding multiple organizations for multiple components of what's essentially a single project.
Okay, well, that brings us up to date. I don't see anything else in the chat box here. Oh, here we go. Are grant dollars released to the applicant all at once or in stages?
So our major capital grants, that is one granting program where certainly we do a 5% holdback pending a final report. And it is different than any of our other grant programs where the funds are released right away. But the funds for the approved funds for major capital grants are not released until we've received additional documentation from the organization that provides a clear indication that the project is in fact moving forward. So it is a little bit different, but all of those details are laid out in the terms of grant agreement. That's a great question.
Okay, I'm not seeing anything else here. Maybe we could give folks just a moment or two in case anything else, in case they're typing.
That sounds good.
There's a few folks that we've answered directly through the chat. So if you haven't had your question answered, just scroll back and there's probably a message there from Joanna with the answers.
And Carrie, you had mentioned kind of off the top that a few people had to log out and log back in again because they lost audio. And so again, just a reminder that this session has been recorded and hopefully in the next few days, it'll be posted on our website. So you'll have access. So if there were parts that you missed, absolutely, you'll be able to watch and listen to it again. All right, did that spur any last minute questions?
Nope, not seeing anything else.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. As I mentioned, if you have, more specific questions to your organization's circumstances, feel free to reach out to us directly. And again, maybe my parting words of wisdom are just to give yourselves lots of time to submit that stage 1 application, because as I've mentioned as part of the presentation, we've got a new grant application portal, which we're excited about, but which there will certainly be a learning curve for us as staff and being able to support you with your application. So again, thank you all for coming and have a great rest of your day.